And so then when Trump wins in a massive upset, suddenly they have a big problem, because how can they explain that a guy that they told all of their people was the second coming of Hitler, how could 62 million Americans vote for Hitler, right? And so they have a big problem there. How do you explain that away? Are 62 million Americans Nazis, right? No, that doesn't make any sense. Like that's a bridge too far. Then they see the Russia collusion narrative sitting right there in front of them and say, why don't we just say that he cheated?
Welcome back to episode 4 of Genuine Questions, where we're going to discuss these allegations that Trump is this Manchurian candidate working on behalf of Vladimir Putin. So there's a lot to get into on this one, so it is going to be a two-parter. So to start, I want to pick up where we left off on the last video, where we talked about how the CIA knew from the jump that these allegations were started by the Clinton campaign to deflect from her email scandal. The CIA director admitted that he knew this, and his only justification was, well, that's not illegal, that's just politics. That's campaign activity. And maybe it is just politics, and politics are a dirty game. But it is illegal for law enforcement to take known political opposition research, dress it up like it's legitimate intelligence, and then use that information to get a warrant to spy on American citizens, which is what the intelligence community subsequently did. So it's due to this Trump-Russia investigation that it came out, or at least I wasn't aware of it before this investigation happened, that there is something called a FISA court, which is a secret court with secret judges that the government goes to when they want to spy on a U.S. citizen. So let's get the ball rolling with this clip from a documentary called The Plot Against the President, which is available in full on Amazon Prime. I like this documentary because it didn't really provide any information that I wasn't already aware of, just on based on public reporting, but it does do a really great job of laying out the facts in the correct timeline. So most, not all, but most of the clips that we're going to watch in this series will be from that documentary. I've obviously picked out the best parts for us to watch, but I do encourage anyone who's interested to go on Amazon and watch that entire documentary. It's about 90 minutes, but for time's sake, I did have to leave some good stuff in there off of our video, so you should go watch the whole thing yourself. But this first clip that I'm going to show is a great explanation of this secret FISA court and how it is supposed to operate.
The FISA warrant process has to be followed carefully, and it matters because the warrants are issued ex parte. Here's what I mean. Imagine you're being sued, and you don't know you're being sued, and you can't have a lawyer to defend you in court, and then you found out you just lost a lawsuit. There's not an American who would say that's the most unfair process I've ever heard in my life, and you would say that's the FISA court process. You're being essentially sued in court, and you're not allowed to have a lawyer, and you're not allowed to even know that you're being sued. You're not allowed to look at any of the information being used against you, and you just lost, because now they have a FISA warrant and they can just do whatever they want. That goes against everyone's fundamental sense of fairness as a person. Now, the reason, of course, you don't tell the person you're about to spy on them is because you think they're a terrorist, and if you tell them we're spying on you, obviously they'll change. The compromise or the deal with the devil was supposed to be that in exchange for not giving the person the due process rights that go back to the Magna Carta, that just go back to your holy book of choice, the idea that if you're accused, you're allowed to face your accusers. You have this in every major religious tradition. The deal with the devil, though, is that everything will be meticulously audited, it'll be reviewed, everything will be truthful, everything will be bulletproof. That procedure, of course, wasn't followed.
So I have no idea if this FISA court was designed to be secretive with anonymous judges because it is standard practice for law enforcement to provide them with any sort of bullshit justification that they can put on paper to spy on an American citizen, and then the judges just rubber stamp whatever is presented to them. And this is just the only time that they got caught doing this because it was such a high-profile investigation into a presidential candidate. Or it could be that these career politicians took drastic measures to deceive the FISA court because they were just so desperate to make sure they could get Trump out. And I would like to know the answer to that, but I don't really see anybody who is asking those questions as of right now. So hopefully at some point we do get to the bottom of that. I think it would be interesting to know how that court actually operates. But for now, all we can do is look at the facts of how the Department of Justice conducted this particular investigation. And it's been proven and admitted that they abused the FISA court process in multiple ways. But we are going to look at two of those ways that have been, at least in my judgment, proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The first way that I want to talk about is how they use this Hillary opposition research in their warrant to spy on a member of the Trump campaign. And if you remember, this whole investigation was based on this document they called the Steele dossier, which was published by the hard-hitting news organization BuzzFeed. And here is a clip that explains the many reasons why it is very concerning that that document was used in a justification to spy on an American citizen.
This intelligence community assessment, and at the end they start talking about this information, about this dossier information. Very clearly I asked, where did this come from? These are pretty serious accusations.
The author of the document, we had found out, was an FBI source. So I said, okay, if he's an FBI source, I said, Devin, he's getting paid. We had to dig into his background a little bit just to verify for ourselves. Yeah, he's a career intelligence officer. He's worked with the United States and other partners around the country, had spent time in Russia. So looks good on paper, but what I found out at the Department of Justice is just because it looks good on paper doesn't mean that person's legit. And, you know, the biggest example of that is James Comey. Through our investigative process, we found out that a firm representing Christopher Steele, Fusion GPS, was somehow involved in the matter. Walked him through the investigation. I said, this is why I think this happened. This source said X. We can prove it if we subpoena the bank. It wasn't like we served the subpoena and everybody went away. Fusion GPS forced us into federal court into litigation over the subpoena itself. And that was when everybody was like, we're on to something.
Fusion GPS is a very, they're very talented at what they do. They're a racketeering outfit. They're essentially, they make things up about people. They spread it to the people in the press. They get them to run the fake news stories. And then even worse, then they find different ways to feed it into the FBI.
And all of these things sort of started coming together in a very unusual fashion. I said, Devin, we're following the money, and I'm going to tell you right now that the DNC and Hillary paid for this. It always goes back to the money, and it's the easiest thing to follow because you have to document it in some fashion or you got to move it in some way. We were able to, pursuant to the judge's authority, visit banks, attorneys, and review in closed session the records. And we were not allowed to disclose it to anybody what we reviewed. And then finally, on the eve of the ruling of the court, Fusion disclosed that Christopher Steele had been paid by the DNC themselves. There were names that would eventually come out that were being paid by Fusion. Names now that are public, but at the time weren't. Nellie Orr, the wife of Bruce Orr, was being paid by Fusion GPS. We would come to learn to do Russian intelligence information gathering and then submit it to the FBI. We were able to figure out that the attorneys, Perkins Coie, were the attorneys for the DNC. Nellie had been working, Bruce's wife, had been working for Fusion GPS. The folks that Perkins Coie paid $10 million to, and then they took that $10 million and paid Christopher Steele $168,000 to dig up dirt. They paid Nellie Orr, I think, $50,000 to do her research against the president and his daughter, and they fed all of that directly to the Bureau, who then used it in the FISA and in the investigation against the president. So now you've connected the money and the people and put the political party right in the middle of your opponent. It's outrageous. Central thesis of the dossier was Carter Page, a Trump campaign associate, is a Russian, basically, asset. And the critical mass in the dossier, in the Steele dossier, was it said Carter Page went to Russia, met with these two guys, Russian oligarchs, and the Steele dossier said at that meeting, Carter Page, a member of the Trump campaign, negotiated an agreement whereby he would get 10 to 15% of Rosneft, which is like the biggest gas firm in Russia, in exchange for his cooperation to work on behalf of the Russians to get better agreements from the Americans when Donald Trump's elected. Now, I told Devin, I said, if that's true, he's a Russian agent, the FISA was righteous, and a lot of people are going to have a lot of problems. But I also said, if that's false, they're screwed. If the Steele dossier were true, the Russians were going to pay this guy $12 billion. Like, okay, open up a bank account. Where's this guy going to move his money? Turns out they had nothing to back up their claims.
Cash had gotten FISAs before, so he knew they had done something really corrupt in order to get that warrant.
So as a fun little throwback to everybody who's watched the Benghazi episode, let's listen to Trey Gowdy talk about who one of the sources of information for the Steele dossier actually was.
Weeks before the election, somebody in the Obama State Department was feeding information from a foreign source to Christopher Steele.
When you hear who the source, one of the sources of that information is, you're going to think, oh my gosh, I've heard that name somewhere before. Where could it possibly have been? And
the foreign source?
The domestic source. And I'm trying to think how Secretary Clinton defined him. I think she said he was an old friend who emailed her from time to time.
Sidney Blumenthal?
That'd be really warm if you're warm. Yeah.
Interesting how the same names keep popping up when it concerns the Clintons' inner circle and all their scandals. But the FISA court has the highest standard of proof because those judges are granting the government permission to violate a citizen's rights. And they're doing it under the guise of national security. But the judges don't independently verify that the information presented to them is accurate. They rely on the credibility of the investigators to sign the document, swearing that everything in the document is accurate. So it takes a lot of credibility and integrity that you're assuming in these investigators. And I am basing this off of the word of the one-time acting Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, or Rosenstein, I'm not sure how you actually pronounce that, but so you can listen to him describe this process and take his word for it instead of mine.
In order to get a FISA search warrant, you need an affidavit signed by a career federal law enforcement officer who swears that the information in the affidavit is true and correct to the best of his knowledge and belief. And that's the way we operate. And if it's wrong, sometimes it is, if you find out there's anything incorrect in there, that person is going to face consequences.
So while we're patiently waiting for somebody to suffer some of those consequences for doing this, let's watch another clip on how they used this dossier that, by the way, Christopher Steele, the guy who wrote it, testified in British court that he had no idea if the stuff he wrote down was even true or not. He just heard it and he wrote it down. So if the guy who wrote the document can't verify if it's true, there is no way that our FBI investigators who signed the document in their application to the warrant to spy on an American citizen, there's no way that those investigators could prove it's true because the guy they got the information from doesn't know if it's true.
The dossier was used in the FISA. So we had shredded the credibility of the dossier. And then once we found out it was in the FISA, we couldn't tell anyone yet. Once those two merged, I said, Devin, this is insane that this document was used to go up on a surveillance warrant of an American citizen.
He knew Christopher Steele was leaking to the State Department and news media because he had the State Department's documents. That's derogatory information. They didn't tell the court that. They knew that Carter Page was an asset for the CIA, not a stooge for the Russians. They didn't tell the court that. They knew that George Papadopoulos and Carter Page had made statements of innocence, not knowing they were being recorded by the undercover informant Stefan Halper. They don't tell the court that, even though it's in the book, it's in the manual, the FBI manual. It's what you got to do.
To spy on the Trump campaign, the FBI used the 3-jump rule.
Not only
get to spy on Carter Page, but you get 2 jumps, or as the Obama administration would have it, 3 jumps from Carter Page, the surveilled person. Having wiretapped Carter Page, you can now wiretap Steve Bannon. Corey Lewandowski then talks to Trump. You've got a 3rd jump, so now you're wiretapping everyone. So that's what they were trying to do, figuring if they could get into the Trump campaign, somewhere there would be a crime.
When we asked Andy McCabe, could you have gotten the FISA application against Carter Page without the Steele dossier? And he said no. We came up with the 3C questions we were going to ask every single witness. Do you have any evidence or information that the Trump campaign colluded, conspired, or coordinated with any member of the Russian government, with any member of the Trump campaign or Trump presidency? And all 65 witnesses under oath said no to every question. We had to ask that because they were saying it in the media that happened, so these principals were the ones who would have to know that. And if they answered yes, we'd have to report that to the public. And they couldn't just answer a simple question of, where's the dirt?
Not a single one of them could cite any evidence whatsoever that they saw. That's what was going on behind closed doors. Then on TV, you go there and you see Schiff come out and talking about how, more treason has been revealed by Trump.
All you have right now is a circumstantial case.
Actually, no, Chuck. I can tell you that the case is more than that, and I can't go into the particulars, but there is more than circumstantial evidence.
Before we move on, I just want to say that evidence is binary. It's either circumstantial or direct. There's no third category that falls between the two. So Adam Schiff is full of shit when he says that. What he means is there is no direct evidence to tie Trump to the Russians. And, of course, the way that he's saying it just sounds much better politically, so they don't have to admit that. So now let's talk about the other way that the FISA court was abused. And information collected through a FISA warrant is highly classified, and intentionally so, to protect the identity of the U.S. citizens who are being spied upon, because they are still innocent until proven guilty. So let's kick this one off with this exchange between Gowdy and James Comey discussing why this practice is so important.
But FISA and other surveillance programs are intentionally designed to preserve the privacy of U.S. citizens. They are intentionally designed to ensure the information is collected and used only for legitimate national security and criminal investigative purposes. There are statutory safeguards. There are warrants based on probable cause. There is a FISA court that is involved. There are audits on the back end, and we think so highly of this material. It is a felony punishable by up to 10 years in federal prison to unlawfully disseminate it. In February of this year, the New York Times reported a U.S. citizen, whose name I will not use, discusses sanctions with the Russian ambassador in a phone call. According to officials who have seen a transcript of the wire-tapped conversation. I thought it was against the law to disseminate classified information.
In general, yes, it's a serious crime, and it should be, for the reasons you said.
Now, is there an exception in the law for current or former U.S. officials who request anonymity?
No.
But you're not aware of an exception in the current dissemination of classified information statute that carves out an exception for reporters?
No, I'm not aware of anything carved out in the statute.
We, the American people, give certain powers to government to keep us safe. And when those powers are misused, and the motive is not criminal investigations or national security, then I'll bet you my fellow citizens are rethinking their side of the equation. Because that U.S. citizen could be them next time. It could be you. It could be me. It could be anyone.
So the person that Gowdy was referring to there, the man whose name he was declining to use, he was talking about Michael Flynn. And much of the documentary that these clips are coming from is about how and why Michael Flynn specifically was targeted. And I found that entire story very interesting, but the why is not exactly relevant to what I want to talk about in this series. So I cut that out for time's sake, but I do encourage people to go look into that part of the story if they are interested. So this is another short clip, though, that sums up the how Michael Flynn was targeted by the FBI.
There are probably reasons why the intel bureaucracies are specifically resistant to change, because they really are unaccountable. If you're unaccountable for a long time, you get used to being unaccountable, and accountability sounds bad. Like, you don't want to have to, if you haven't never answered to anybody, you don't want to have to answer to somebody. Especially when some of the things you've been doing when exposed might make you look bad.
Of all the people who came into the White House, Mike Flynn was the most dangerous to the swamp. He had to be taken out. They knew he knew what the intelligence community was up to.
And I think there were people inside the West Wing, right up to President Obama, who became anti-Michael Flynn for all the wrong reasons.
Flynn's calls were intercepted by the U.S. intelligence community. Secret transcripts show Flynn did discuss the sanctions, a potential violation of federal law prohibiting private citizens from engaging in diplomacy.
From the very beginning, this conversation that General Flynn had with the Russian ambassador was about a UN resolution that was coming up. He was advocating for the United States. It's exactly what you'd want someone to say. Let's de-escalate this. Let's not try to make it worse than what it is.
There's nothing wrong or unusual about an incoming transition team talking to folks in other countries about foreign policy. Obama did it as he should do it. Flynn did what he should do.
You read the transcript, Susan Rice admits this is what she did. Of course she had a transition period. Of course they talked to other countries. If you weren't talking to other countries, you weren't doing your job.
And of course, you know, the intelligence agencies are listening to Kislyak conversation. That's kind of what they do.
I believe that if anyone inside of the United States government would be fully aware of U.S. intelligence collection capabilities, tactics, procedures, it would be somebody like a Michael Flynn.
They pretended not to know what everybody in the field knows, that when you telephone the Russian ambassador, you're not meeting him in a park at night. You telephone him, you are basically telling the U.S. system, the intelligence people, what you want them to hear, what you say.
You look at this White House now, and it's hard to imagine two FBI agents ending up in the sit room. How did that happen?
I sent them. Something I probably wouldn't have done or maybe gotten away with in a more organized investigation, a more organized administration, in the George W. Bush administration, for example, or the Obama administration. And in both of those administrations, there was process. And so if the FBI wanted to send agents into the White House itself to interview a senior official, you would work through the White House counsel, and there'd be discussions and approvals, and who would be there. And I thought it's early enough. Let's just send a couple guys over.
Oh, I pulled that off. I basically played a trick and got away with it. If it had been a more experienced administration, I wouldn't have gotten away with it. And the audience was, oh, isn't it, how funny to set up an innocent man.
2 or 3 days before he resigned, we got a phone call from the Washington Post. And a reporter had said that he had just interviewed Mike Flynn. And Mike Flynn made statements about his phone call to the Russian ambassador, said that he hadn't discussed sanctions. But the Washington Post reporter says, but we have a transcript, or they were read a transcript, that says the opposite. They're talking about a phone call that would have been classified at the highest level, and yet somehow the Washington Post had a copy of it.
I really like this next clip that we're going to watch because Trey Gowdy does a beautiful job of getting James Comey to just state the most obvious, basic steps you would take in an investigation, and then basically ask the question, like, all right, why aren't you doing that? Why aren't you looking into who leaked this person's name? It's classified information. It's a 10-year felony offense. So why don't you care who did that? Why don't you care who unmasked or leaked this U.S. citizen's name? Because as we just heard in that last clip, there was really no point to leaking this guy's name because he didn't do anything wrong. He was just doing his job.
I guess what I'm getting at, Director Comey, is you say it's vital, you say it's critical, you say it's indispensable. We both know it's a threat to the reauthorization of 702 later on this fall. And oh, by the way, it's also a felony punishable by up to 10 years. So how would you begin your investigation, assuming for the sake of argument that a U.S. citizen's name appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times unlawfully? Where would you begin that investigation?
You would start by figuring out, so who are the suspects? Who touched the information that you've concluded ended up unlawfully in the newspaper, and start with that universe, and then use investigative tools and techniques to see if you can eliminate people or include people as more serious suspects.
How many people within the FBI are part of the unmasking process?
So I can find out the exact number. I don't know it as I sit here.
Well, it would be nice to know the universe of people who have the power to unmask a U.S. citizen's name, because that might provide something of a roadmap to investigate who might have actually disseminated a masked U.S. citizen's name. But if there are 100 people who have the ability to unmask and the knowledge of a previously masked name, then that's 100 different potential sources of investigation. And the smaller the number is, the easier your investigation is. So the number is relevant, but I get that people want to know. I get the jury always wants to know why. It certainly wasn't done to help an ongoing criminal investigation, because you already had the information, didn't you? Is there something a reporter would have access to that the head of the FBI would not?
I would hope not when it relates to the
I would hope not too, since it's part of our surveillance programs. And Admiral Rogers, the motive couldn't have been to help you, because you already had it. So in the universe of possible motives for the felonious dissemination of classified material, we could rule out wanting to help the intelligence communities and the law enforcement communities. That leaves some more nefarious motives. But some of the words that appeared in this public reporting include the word transcript, which has a very unique use in the matters that you and I are discussing this morning. That is a very unique use of that word. Wiretap has a very specific meaning. The name of a U.S. citizen that was supposed to statutorily be protected is no longer protected. I'm just simply asking you to assure the American people, can you assure them that it is going to be investigated?
I can't.
So just to keep track, first James Comey cites this non-existent exception that Hillary should not be prosecuted because she was lacking intent. Then he misuses the FISA court process and typical FBI protocols to start investigations into members of the Trump campaign. And then he says he's not going to look into which government officials participated in deceiving the FISA court and misusing that information that was gathered. Yet we are supposed to believe that he is a man of integrity and credibility. So that's a good stopping point here for part 1 of the Trump-Russia investigation. We're going to come back in part 2 and discuss the media's role in this story, as well as a couple of things that were uncovered through the Mueller investigation. So as always, thank you for watching. Genuine questions.
My biggest regret of the last 4 years was not being more vocal about what they did to General Flynn. I just said, man, there must be something here if this many people that run these institutions, I still had faith as an American in these institutions. And it was the most misguided faith I've ever had in anything in my life.
We're going to do a true assessment of the veracity of the information that we're getting. We're not just going to look at the conclusions. We're going to look at the substance behind those conclusions. Look for biases, look for areas in which it's not accurate, and then pursue those to determine what is the truth.